everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Bone Club. It's I, Ashley Smith, with Stephanie,
Hey everyone!
and we have a great guest with us today, Dr. Daniel Wescott from Texas State University, who's going to be talking with us about decompositional research facilities and just some of the stuff that goes on with them and the gestalt that surrounds those. So we want to welcome you all today. Dr. Wescott, welcome to the show. I guess the first question that we wanted to ask is, like with all the rest of the guests we have, what got you interested in forensic anthropology? You have been around the block in this field for a while. What got you interested in this field?
Okay. Well, first, let me say hi to everybody, and thank you for having me. I appreciate it. So for me, I actually have always been interested in bones. So the way that I kind of got started in anthropology was that when I was, I started out as a cabinet maker, and I then realized at some point that if I wanted to make any money in cabinet making, I was going to have to start my own business. So I went to college, and part of that was I was always interested in I didn't really know that much about anthropology, but I was interested in anthropology. I had taken an anthropology class in high school. And so I started taking an anthropology class, and so before the class, I would hang out in a little library that was adjacent to the anthropology department. And one day, one of the biological anthropologists came in and said, somebody brought in some skeletal remains. Is there anybody here that's interested in looking at them? And of course, I jumped up and I went in, and this anthropologist's name was Kim Snyder. And so I went and worked in Kim Snyder's lab. And pretty much by the end of the day, I changed my major and kind of never looked back.
Matt?
What high school did you go to? I was like, what high school did you go to that had an anthropology class in high school? I'm jealous. So
but it's really kind of funny because I took this anthropology class in high school, and like I said, I thought it was really cool. We actually even went on a little excavation and did some archaeology stuff. And then later, when I was a graduate student, my high school teacher actually took a class with me.
That's awesome. Full circle.
Full circle, yes.
We also, by the way, want to welcome one of the most cutest kitties on the planet to the show as well.
I know, I feel like we should take a photo of the cat and post it with the recording just so that everyone can see how adorable.
Yes, this is Joy. And she has decided that she would like to come and visit.
We love all animals. And you talked how you got into forensic anthropology, but a lot of your research has actually been in decomposition. Right. What got you into that? I've done my master's research was in decomposition.
Right.
And it's one of those, I highly recommend every anthropologist do one research study in that. But I don't know if I could do two.
It's also not for everyone.
For me, it was actually not something that I originally had a strong interest in. Part of the reason I got involved in it is because of the job that I have. And, that is, and it's also, part of my job is to facilitate research in forensic taphonomy. And so I've done that. And as a result, you get, you see stuff, and you get, start asking questions and realize that, hey, there are things that could be answered, especially multidisciplinary. One of the things that I think that I found with decomposition research that I've been fascinated with is the fact that you have entomologists and microbiologists and soil scientists and anthropologists, and we're all actually trying to answer the same question.
Mm-hmm.
We're just going about it different ways. And so, a lot of what I'm interested in is how do we actually combine our skills to do this? And when do we know when, the anthropologist is better doing it, when the entomologist is doing it better? And, part of that depends on the decomposition process and everything. And for me, decomposition, the research on that, I'm really more interested in the basic research of it. Trying to understand this, this carry-on, this human cadaver or whatever you want to refer to them as at the time, as this kind of ecological niche that is being utilized by all kinds of scavengers, to get as much nutrients out of it as they possibly can in a short term, and how that then we can utilize that data to understand, to reconstruct crime scenes outdoors, or we can understand postmortem interval, or even maybe burial practices or something from past populations. So that's how I kind of got started in this, and I've found it to be a pretty fascinating area of research.
For me, actually, what led me to my master's research at Boston University was we were doing some just typical readings that you do at the master's level. And I had noticed that some of these theories that we held with sort of time since death and processes that affect rates of decomposition were based on what I'd call faulty studies. Like my master's research looked at penitive trauma and the rate of decomposition.
Mm-hmm.
And what led me to that was there was a study that looked at all these different factors of decomposition. And one of them was, hey, if you have penitive trauma, it accelerates the rate of decomposition. And it had a N of 2, a control and an exsanguinated remains that an autopsy was done on. And I said, this is not a good study. We need to do an actual real study. And then as I started doing the research for that, one of the things that really got me is this entire time, this entire field we've studied, we always talk about how pigs are a great analogous model for human decomposition. And as I was doing the literature and just following it, all right, this one cites this one cites this. It goes all the way back to an article by Jerry Payne. And when you read that, that's not what he said. He was talking about insect succession.
Right.
He wasn't talking about the model itself. And it just became this game of telephone where we started to go from insect succession pig is a good analogous model to pig itself is an analogous model.
Right.
And that got me just interested in we have to do a much better job of looking at decomposition and looking at decompositional research. And one of the things I like about Texas State and what you have at TSU is everything up to that point seemed to have been done at the University of Tennessee. And there's nothing knocking UT. It's holy altar of forensic anthropology. But what does Texas State offer that we can't do at UT? It's every environment changes decomposition, right? So we have to have those different facilities. Is that something that TSU offers?
Sure. I mean, to some extent. I mean, I think that one of the nice things is over the years that we've gotten to where we actually are getting some, bigger variety with, you know, uh, University of North Michigan, for example, which has got, snow. They like have 127 inches of snow a year or something like that. So, pretty much from October to May, they're covered in snow, versus, Tennessee, which is a hot, humid place, where Texas, we're humid, but we have, really high temperatures. I mean, this has been a remarkable year, but normally we have, 30 to 90 days of over 100-degree weather. Um, and so, just things like that can make a difference. And part of it too is also just the way I should say the cover of trees and stuff like that. One of the things that makes a big difference here is vultures. So, because of the cattle industry, the history behind all that, Texas is full of vultures, and pretty much anything that dies within a few days will be scavenged by vultures, and that includes human remains if they're not caged. Which in Tennessee there are vultures, but they're not nearly as prevalent, and they're also, they're a big bird that it's kind of timid, and so they don't really like to be up underneath tree cover and stuff. Not that they wouldn't do it, but they tend to not prefer that. So, so all those things make a difference. And I think just having different facilities with different ideas and different researchers coming, and there are things that are always going to be similar. I mean, in some ways, insect activity is a good example. It doesn't vary a lot from facility to facility. The timing has more to do with temperature and things like that. But there are other factors that affect it. And like I said, solar radiation is actually one thing that, for me, I think is an important factor that a lot of people don't think about in just the intense sun that we get here in Texas.
And the other thing I think that's really important is when you look at, I've seen the Tennessee facility. I think what a lot of people don't understand, particularly general public, they hear, they have this facility. They don't realize it's kind of dinky. I mean, it's really, really small and sort of slopes to one side. But Texas State, you have, if I'm not mistaken, pretty large facility to work with. Does that offer an ability to do different types of research?
Yeah, I don't know how much it types, but yeah, I mean, it's a lot bigger facility, and the difference too is Tennessee, because of the way that Bill Bass created it, it is a couple of acres that are located behind the university hospital. Where at Texas State we have 26 acres that's set aside for the research, but it sits on about a 4,200 acre ranch. So, there's not you don't have the same kind of activity from the city and all that kind of stuff going on. And also, you're not having bodies, which probably has a big effect on like entomological research. You're not having bodies that are literally sitting next to each other all the time. And so if we have somebody that wants to do research where they have their body, the cadaver that they're using or the cadavers they're using set aside, that can be done. We've had people that have done research like specifically looking at vulture activity, where we can build a fence where, you can reach it from the sky, but you can't get access to it any other way. And so those are the kind of research projects that we can do that you probably can't do at other facilities just because of the fact that you've got the space to do it.
I have a question for, I guess, in your career with all the different research that you either done yourself or have helped students do, I guess, do you have one project that like you hold dear to yourself, or that like it surprised you, the result came like I guess saying your favorite research project is a little odd, but like when you like think about your career, which project do you think back on with such joy and stuff like that?
Um, I don't know. There isn't. So I get asked this by reporters all the time. It's like, what is the big thing that you guys have done and that, it's changed the world? And in reality, it's all the little things that have done that have changed, made a big difference in understanding. You were just talking about, like penetrating rate. Trauma. We've had people have done looking at autopsied remains versus non-autopsied remains, but we also just had a student that looked at, does the size of the wound make a difference? And she actually found that if you had like a little 1-inch incision, no flies ever actually came to any of those. Where if you had a little bit bigger incision, it made a difference. But so all those kind of add up in helping us in our knowledge. If I had to say one that's kind of been for me been really interesting recently, and that is I had a student that just recently went back and looked at 10 years worth of data. And so she looked at total body scores and ADD and looked for patterns that are associated with, precipitation and, any kind of thing like that. And what was interesting, what she found was that the main factor was mean annual temperature, which tells us that as the mean annual temperature increases with climate change, so does decomposition. So those are the kind of studies that I think that the longitudinal data that we collect is probably where most of the real research is going to, come from. We have a student now that's going to be looking at 10 years worth of data, looking at, AI stuff. And, is there patterns in decomposition that we don't realize, So like for one example, if you look at like something like the total body score, one of the things that they talk about is the coloration changes. But, they go from like greenish to a gray or something like that. Well, we see all kinds of things like oranges and, purples and all kinds of other colors. And so does that color make a difference or is it just a color change? And so I think that's going to be done by looking at lots of data, big studies, and lots of data from lots of different places. And I think that's going to make a big difference. And so that's the kind of stuff I'm really excited about. And so a lot of the longitudinal data that we've been collecting, I think, has got the greatest potential. I mean, even we've done stuff for like law enforcement where, like they have somebody who was diabetic and they're more decomposed than they expected them to be. Well, the diabetes play a role. It's pretty hard to do that if you want to lay out, 20 people that are diabetic, 20 people that are not diabetic. But if you go back to the longitudinal data and look at 800 people, now you can actually make some real significant, claims about whether it makes a difference or not, and what are the factors that affect that.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. I know when I first went into grad school, I thought I wanted to do decomp research, and I was like all excited for it. But I went to like a smaller university that definitely didn't have a facility of any kind, and I like went in kind of thinking how we were talking earlier. I was like, well, I'll just do it on pigs. It'll be fine. Everything's great. And then my teacher was just like, maybe we change what we're doing here because I don't think that's going to be all that helpful. And so it's like definitely really like, even though I didn't necessarily go into decomp research, it's always been fascinating to me to just like see what people come up with, and like just the questions that can be answered with that type of like facility of, those long-term changes, and what can you really say, and what is this random anomaly because you did a test on 2 people or whatever. So that's all.
Well, and that's the thing, like one of the things that you also learn is that what are the limitations of what you can say.
Mhm.
And, I actually frequently get asked, by defense lawyers, it's like, well, we have this case and they said that the person died, 2 months and 3 days and 12 hours ago or something like that.
Mhm.
And a lot of what I am doing is saying, yeah, even if they wanted to say that, they just don't have the ability. They don't have anything to back it. So, which is also important. I mean, you think about it, if we're in forensic anthropology, I mean, our purpose is to, you know, provide as much truth about what happened at that scene as possible, whether that exonerates the person that they think is guilty or not, you know. So
Our job is not to speak to the criminality of the defendant, but to the victim itself.
right, exactly.
And you brought up total body scores and everything, and that I wanted to pick your brain. It's not one of the questions I actually wrote down, but I used it in my master's thesis, and I've always had it, and I've taught it. Accumulated degree days. Megesi et al. 2005. There's something about it because it uses temperature alone. And I just have this thing about there's so many other factors involved in decomposition. What's your thoughts? Can we use a formulary that rely, and I'm not asking you to comment on that particular paper, but can we use a formulary that relies on pure temperature, or do we need to have one, or should we try to come up with one that includes things like humidity data that does have influence in decomposition? Is there something that needs to be a bit more encompassing? And can AI be that tool that helps us?
Yeah, I mean, I think AI has the potential to do stuff, and but also I think it's the shiny new item that may or may not have as much potential in the long run as if we think it does. But I agree with you in that sense. So for me, what I have found is that total body score is a good way of standardizing the way we collect data, right?
Mhm. Yeah.
Whether you use the formula or not. Now, the formula, I do think, has to, if you really want an accurate formula, has to include other items. I mean, you think about it, even if you go back and use just temperature, but you go back and you find out, well, the day that that person, based on the mean ADD died, it was raining. Well, that affects things because guess what? Flies don't like to land on bodies when it's raining,
Yeah.
or it was really windy that day. And, so there are other factors like that that are going to have a huge effect on an accurate estimation of the decomposition. And so I think we have to take that in consideration. But I also think that is true with, that's the difference between having somebody who's an expert look at the data and interpreting the postmortem interval versus somebody who just plugs in the numbers and says, "Oh, this is the results." But I mean, that's true if you're looking at, sex estimation or anything else like that. Is that part of what you're expected to do as an expert is to look at that data, utilize the methods that are there, but also realize when those methods are lying to you, and or not necessarily lying to, but you're not giving you the full information.
Interpretation.
Right. And so that's part of being the expert. Otherwise, we could just say, okay, here's the formula. Anybody on the street can plug in things and come up with the correct results. And I mean, if when you teach classes, you realize that that's not true, because you get the undergraduates that you give them exactly the same thing and they come up with these wildly different answers.
To change the topic a little bit, there are unfortunately many in society that question the ethics of having decompositional research facilities. They argue that the research itself is desecrating bodies and is unethical, sort of just on spec. How do you address those ethical concerns? How do you deal with them?
So, first of all, I think that everybody should be able to have some consent or have some say into what happens to their remains after they die. Mm-hmm. And so with us, the way that we deal with this is that the people that we donate, they donate specifically to us. They're not donating to some like general anatomical pool or something like that. So they know what's going to be done with them, right? Or at least to the knowledge that they want to know. I mean, right? And this is something that they find important. And so, that right there takes care of most of the ethical issues. The other stuff, if you don't agree with, that dead bodies should be used for research, well, that's a different story, right? But it's not associated with the ethics of the research itself or anything like that, because these people have consented to this. So they have consented to this. This is something that they want to see done. And like I said, most of the time they have a really good understanding of what's going to happen. For us, we even have, people who are registered donors that will come into the lab, and we give them tours of not the decom facility, but of the skeletal lab, and talk about what happens to the remains and the processes that we go through and all that kind of stuff, and they are thrilled with it. We also, once we have the remains have been decomposed and been processed down to a skeleton, the families can come visit the skeletal remains, and it's amazing how many families come in. And we also keep track of every research project, every class, anything that the remains are used in. And so when the families come in, we can say, look, we can talk about, like a lot of times I'll come in, bring them in, and I'll be like, okay, there's a broken bone here. This is what I could tell you about it, stuff like that. And they'll be like, oh yeah, I remember when that happened, and stuff like that. So it's actually good for them in that sense too. But it also, gives us a little bit more information about the individual as well. And then we can also talk to them about all the research that's been done. And frequently they are like, oh man, Dad would have loved that. That is something that really he would have found fascinating, and sometimes their only involvement in that research project might even be that they are the control sample. So, like we do a lot of research on obesity. And so, in every study that we do, if we have a 54-year-old obese male, for example, we find a 54-year-old non-obese male. And so that, they may be that the non-obese individual, but they still find that it's really fascinating that their dad was involved in that study.
Do they get how much say do they get in sort of do they get a chance to say, hey, I would like to be in research project 1225A, or
Yes
is
and
it
no.
just here, I'm donating to the facility, please use my remains in whichever research project my remains would be most appropriate?
That is most people. There are people who specifically have, um, things that they would like to get done and or be a part of, and we will tell them up front, if it's available, we will do this.
Mhm.
And one of the things that we get a lot is vulture research. Is people saying, "I would love to be part of a vulture research project."
Mhm.
Well, that's fine as long as there's a vulture research project going on.
Yeah.
But we also, we do things like we do fire death investigation work and looking at, thermal trauma. We've done, we do a lot of stuff with clandestine remains, for example. How do you locate clandestine remains using remote sensing and those kind of things? And and in those cases, sometimes we will get people to say, "I don't want to be burned," or "I don't want to be buried." Well, we honor that. If they say that, then we find another project for them. I think that's pretty rare because most of them are like, "Oh yeah, whatever it takes." But I they also, so that's the other thing too, is that you by law you really don't have to have them consent to like everything, but we usually we always ask, are you okay if we do some kind of destructive type of analysis? Now, what I think you also could get into what is destructive analysis, considering the fact that they're decomposing. But um, I mean, I think that most people have some kind of idea. Can I explode you? Can I, shoot you with a gun? Something like that. And I would say that 99% of the people are more than happy to sign off on that. And it's not just if you don't say something, you're consenting. They have to actually initial off on it. So, to me, that all takes away the ethical dilemmas of, you have consent, the bodies are treated with respect, even, I mean, even if they're in a study where they're being, you know, burned or something like that, they're being treated with respect and they're being, curated properly. They're being utilized to better the world. And I don't know how more ethical you could get than that.
If you, I guess, I've always wanted to donate my body. That was like definitely on my, I mean, it's on my to-do list eventually to like fill out all the
Hopefully
paperwork.
way down the road.
Yeah, to do all the things. Well, I'm like, I should probably do it before I think about it because then it'll be too late at that point. But I guess, have you ever had, I don't want to say like convinced someone to do it because like that feels unethical, but like if someone was on the fence and you're trying to explain the perks, I guess, of body donation and things like that, do you find you try to do those, or if someone's somewhat on the fence, it's just like a no-go from there? Because I know like for myself, I was like always like, yep, that's what I'm gonna do. I don't need my body in a cemetery somewhere. I learn from other people, they can learn from me, it'll be great. But I know my mom's like, well, if you do that, if you die before you make that paperwork, I'm not doing that for you. And I'm like, but it's my body. I guess. So just like yeah, I don't know.
So there's a couple things with that. One is no, I would never try to, if they're on the fence, then I tell them that, it's time for you to go back and talk to your family and think about this longer. And, you always have the opportunity to do it later. The other thing is that for people that want to do it, I always tell them, it's really important that you talk to your family, because you may want to do this, but if they don't call us, we don't know that you died. It's not like we go through the obituaries every day and go, "Oh, there's John Smith. Let's go get him." Right? So, you know, they have everybody has to be kind of in agreement with this, and I think it is, you know, like a lot of things with life, but you know, I think a lot of times Americans like to avoid talking about death. But, you know, I think it's really important that you do talk about what you would like to have done, because if you don't talk about what you would like to have done, then you're totally reliant on your family to decide, right? So with that being said,
like organ donation.
right, organ donation, anything like that, right? I mean, you could sign up as an organ donor, and if you're the first thing that'll happen when you die is they'll contact you and contact the family, and they'll say, you know, John Smith is your, you know, dad or whatever is an organ donor. Do you consent to that? And if the family says no, they're done. They won't do it. Right?
Yep.
So you have to talk to them ahead of time. And I know this because I used to work in an emergency room at, you know, in the middle of the night. And it was very common that we'd have people that die and their families would say, I know that he really wanted that, but I just can't bear to think about him being cut open. And that was the end of it. They would not proceed with it. Okay. And that's the same thing here. I mean, you know, if it's not something that they want to do. But the other thing I should say is that also one of the parts of the being ethical part of that is that we also do not accept next of kin donations from people who've been estranged from their family members. Right. And there's actually a couple reasons why that. One is that we don't know that that's what that person wanted, and we don't want to be the dumping ground because you don't want to pay for dad's funeral, right? Second of all, they usually don't know anything about the person, which means that the paperwork you get is basically their name and social security number, and that's about it, which is not useful either for the research purposes. So there's a lot of differences behind that. You know, we don't take unclaimed bodies. We definitely don't take unidentified remains. You know, in Texas, we have a justice of the peace system. We frequently get calls from justice of the peace that say, you know, we have, you know, unclaimed remains of so-and-so, and they become the legal next of kin, but we still won't accept their remains because that's not what we want. So most of our next of kin donations are from people who we get a call from the family that says, you know, my dad just died and he is a living donor. And you say, well, we don't have any paperwork on him. He's not a living donor. And they're like, we know he's a living donor because we have the paperwork right here. And it's like, yeah, you have the paperwork because your dad never actually sent it in. Right. But it tells us that dad was at least seriously thinking about that, you know. And then the other ones that we get that are next to kin donations are usually where they donated, for example, to a medical school. And then upon death, the medical school rejected them because medical schools have very, very strict criteria as far as who they will accept. And so a lot of times the families will say, you know, we know that they wanted to donate to a medical school, but we also know that it's more important to them that they get donated to somebody than it is to, you know, just be cremated or buried or something like that. So they're following the wishes of their loved ones, which there again, I don't think you can get any more better consent or more ethical treatment than trying to do something of that nature.
If you had, like, I guess with the paperwork that goes into it, because I have not looked into it fully yet, but what type of information do you request from the living donor about their like life history? I guess because you're saying if they were estranged, maybe they only have their name and their social security number. What other type of information? So I know for myself, what should I be tracking in my own body to be able to donate?
So there are two sides to the paperwork. So one is that when a person dies and donates their bodies to us, we become the uh, basically the funeral. We initiate the death certificate, stuff like that. So there is a component to that we ask, name, social security number, um, military service, things like that have to go onto the death certificate. That information is never released to, for example, researchers. I mean, you'd never have a researcher ask for the name or their social security number or anything like that, obviously. That is totally for the death certificate side of it. For the research side of it, we ask everything from medical histories to activity levels to, you know, weight difference. Like we ask, have you been obese? If you're obese, how long have you been obese? Or, does your weight fluctuate a lot? Things that would affect skeletal remains, but also affect decomposition to some extent, even. Um, what kind of medications were you taking? That really has a big effect on decomposition, depending on the medications they were on. Um, where did you live at different stages of your life? So we usually ask, where did you live the first 20 years of your life? Where did you live the last 20 years of your life? So if we want to do like isotope analysis or something like that, we have that kind of information. We ask, questions about smoking and diabetes and, other things like that some researchers are interested in. And then there are things that we realize that, we've been asking this for 10 years and no researchers ever used it. And so we'll stop collecting that data and switch to something because a lot of times we'll get researchers that are, what you'll find is that multiple people call you and say, do you have data on this? And you're like, oh, no, that'd be a good thing to collect, but we don't. And so after a while, you're like, okay, well, let's drop this. And, so one of the questions that we have for years that we've had is, do you have tattoos? Well, I can look at a picture and tell whether you have a tattoo or not. I don't really need you to answer yes or no on that, right? So, and it's not necessarily useful information. And so let's ask something, more appropriate that might be better for researchers that are especially, you think about a lot of what we're after is what is going to affect the decomposition. And then later on, what is going to affect skeletal morphology? Because that's what most anthropologists are interested in, those two sides. And so trying to improve, what is asked and what is collected, and then realizing that, okay, if nobody's using this data, it's a great thing maybe it's not a great thing to continue to collect. And then you also always have to weigh this with the costs that are associated with collecting that data. So like, for example, one of the things that I would love to have is a CT scan, a whole body CT scan of every donor that comes in. Well, it's outrageously expensive. And so is it worth the data or not? And, I think depending on your research project, you could argue that it is or isn't. But you have to weigh that with, okay, but how do we come up with that money to do that kind of research? So
collaborations.
Yes, collaborations is the key research.
Do you have a certain catchment area that you work with? Because just thinking about it, the cool-warm cycle of remains would affect decomposition if you start looking out beyond a certain geographical area, would it not?
I'm sorry, I don't know if I'm following your question exactly.
Yeah, I just for where you have donations, donors, there are certain geographical area you work with, because if you have donations from somebody, say, if I was on your donor list, I'm in Memphis, Tennessee, I die, my family decides to send my remains to you, they'd have to be cooled before they get to you.
Sure.
Otherwise, there'd be some form of decomposition before it reaches you. That wouldn't that not affect ultimately the research that y'all are doing? Because the starting point is now off.
Sure. And that's always, I mean, even if you're working within the local region, that is always the case. You don't, a lot of times you have no, you have somebody who dies and they may, well, matter of fact, I mean, we may get contacted by a hospice or something like that within minutes after somebody dies. And they say, so and so is a donor, living donor, and they have just passed away. And you also knew that they were getting ready to pass away. So everybody's ready and you go get them. There are other people who they die and they call you and they say, John Smith was a living donor. He died yesterday morning. That's always going to be a factor in in taphonomic research, and you have to take that in consideration. For us too, I mean, the other benefit is that we're interested in skeletal research as well, and so it doesn't affect that aspect of it, right? So it depends on the research protocol that the person is going to be used in. It may be that if you don't get contacted for a day or two, that they just aren't part of that study. They have to be put into a different study, that you're only interested in the people who died almost immediately. But this is always going to be a bias or a factor that affects research at a decomposition facility, is that you're never getting somebody who they just murdered,
Yeah.
and they're laying out in the field 30 seconds after they died. And so, you're never going to have that perfect thing. And that's all something that's part of, doing, understanding that process and knowing the limitations of what you can and can't say.
Yeah, but can you mitigate that by having, or do you mitigate that by having sort of a region by which you have donations, or do you take donations from all across the U.S.?
We will accept donations from all across the U.S. Most of our donors are within 100 miles of us. Okay. And what we have found is that, and this is true with the other facilities, is that, like if I have somebody who family that contacts me and they say, we have a loved one and they're in Houston and they just died. I always say, well, contact Sam Houston University because, they're closer to you. Or, you have somebody that dies, in Colorado, and I'll tell them, contact this facility in Colorado because they're a lot closer and they can get the remains a lot sooner and everything else. There are some families that know, or some people that are like, no, I was a Texas State, graduate. I want to go to Texas State. And, in that case, you have to take that in consideration, and you try to limit the problems associated with that as much as you can by putting them in cold storage or something of that nature. And that's the other thing too, is that a lot of research that's done, or especially early on, was to actually look at factors like that, like if you froze a body, does that affect the research you're doing? If if they've been autopsied, does that affect the research you're doing? And in some cases, it's a definite yes. In some cases, it's like, no, that's not going to affect the questions that I'm asking. And you have to always take that in consideration.
Recently, I've noticed there's been a number of studies, because I had to do it for my doctoral research. A number of studies that have found there's a rather wide disconnect between the number of people that say donating for anatomical research is a good thing for society versus those that actually do donate.
Sure.
Do you find that with your research, with the research at these facilities, that there's a large number of people that would say, yes, this is a great thing, but Joe Blow over here should be the one that donates. It's not for me.
Sure. We get that all the time. I mean, you have people that are just, and that's the truth. The thing is with being associated with a decomposition or taphonomy facility that you'll find is that there are people that are super fascinated and want to know every detail. And then there are people who think that what you're doing is really important and cool, but they don't want you to tell them anything about it. And then, of course, there are those people that just just say that it's just not, you know.
Say for like a lot of our audience that listens to this are undergrad students, and a lot of times you don't necessarily get the opportunity in high school and things like that to see a dead body or to
Sure.
see decomposition and things like that. Do you, I guess, like in your programs or when giving tours or things like that, do you have things that you say or do to prepare people for what they're about to see and do? Or do you find that you won't bring like a student on unless they've already shown that they can handle those types of things? Because I mean, like I work with a lot of people and a lot of anthropologists, and some people just don't like quote unquote the fleshy bits at all.
Right.
Um, but
Uh, I think most people have an idea whether that's going to be true for them or not. There are incidents that, where I had a graduate student one time, for example, that we were I was actually looking at some pictures from a game camera that we had on a body and realized that when she would go out and take pictures of them, she would close her eyes and look away. And so it was like, this is probably not for you, you know. And I think that's an important part of it too, you know. I think most people have less of a reaction than they think they're going to when they actually go out to a facility. Um, for a number of reasons, but I think it's not as bad as I think it's going to be. But but I also tell people, it's something that you really need to think about it as far as like if you like with law enforcement, because of the position that they're in and stuff like that. A lot of times, we will give tours to law enforcement groups or something like that, and I always tell them think about what it is that you're going to be doing because you can't unsee this, right? However, most of the time, what these are people that are going to be in a field that they're going to see much worse, anyhow. So, if anything, it's preparing them a little bit for it.
I say a couple episodes ago, we actually talked about like vicarious traumas and things like that, which I think kind of along the same vein of you think you're prepared and everything's kind of fine, but then maybe it's not. Do you at the university have any programs to try to help mitigate that on the back end if people aren't as okay as they thought they were with the type of research they're doing?
We don't specifically for researchers because, I mean, most of them are a lot. Well, matter of fact, a lot of our researchers are coming from other institutions or something like that. So we do, for at least for a while, I know that the students had a group that would meet occasionally and talk about it. Wasn't, and what they actually found was not so much talking about like the cadavers out at the facility, but was going out on forensic cases where you can see some pretty terrible things that people do to each other, or going through burn cases, stuff like that. So there's that, and then of course most universities have counseling available to students, and we always encourage that, and but the I guess for the facility, I mean, the center itself doesn't have anything specific like that, except for the fact that we've all been there. So there are a lot of people to talk to. And, what I find is that it may be that a student is not comfortable talking to me, but they're comfortable talking to, one of the other staff or one of the other students or something like that. And so usually we can direct people to get the help that they want. I don't necessarily mean that they need, but that they want.
That makes sense.
Oh, go ahead, Steph.
No, you're good. Go ahead.
One of the questions that I have is when I was doing my master's research at Boston University, we have a facility, or they had a facility at the time,
Right.
that they were trying to start up with human remains. But the university's president at the time was foot down, this was not going to happen.
Right.
And a large portion of that was NIMBY. They were terrified of NIMBY. Not in my backyard. Now I know your facility is part of a larger ranch, but do you see that often with these types of facilities where, much like with donations, they're excited for that people see the need for these facilities, but they need to be in the middle of the desert somewhere way out where no one exists.
I would say yes and no. But, part of that, so I'll give you a little background. So I actually went to one time when they were opening a facility. I won't talk about where. I actually went to like a town hall meeting and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And, there were a lot of people. And I remember one guy saying, for example, he's like, I used to live next to one of these facilities. You could smell it 3 miles away, which is absolutely not true. So yes, there are those aspects of it that it's just like, I don't want it in my backyard. Well, what we have found is, that we are as transparent as we can. And not only transparent, but I go out of my way to do, like when, if we have a reporter in San Marcos, which is where the, Texas State's at, that calls me and says, we would like to do a story on this, I jump to it. And why is that? Because I want the people of San Marcos to know what happens to bodies out there. Right? What I don't want is them saying, oh, I wonder what they do with those bodies out there. And then, they can go from, all kinds of conspiracy theories and everything else, right? If they know what's happening, they can either agree with it or disagree with it, but they know what's happening. And they also, like I said, we are a big facility, so it makes it a little more difficult than, some of the smaller facilities that are more, centrally located or something like that. But they realize that, they can't smell it. And the vultures aren't all over their houses. And the vulture, one of the things that we get all the time is, oh, vultures are going to carry the bones and drop them in my yard or something like that. And after a while, they realize that that's not true. And you also can talk to them about the fact that, vultures actually don't carry off bones at all. And the research behind that. And, so actually the other one we get a lot is associated with, oh, the vultures are eating the dead people and then they're flying over and roosting in our trees. So, and a lot of that is just providing the education and also treating it as that's a legitimate, concern. Here's the research that's been done on that. And that's why we are not concerned about it. And if we were concerned about it, trust me, we wouldn't be doing it, right? We also get this with groundwater. And so like we've done research that, it's like, okay, that's a legitimate thing. maybe the fluids are seeping down through the ground and reaching the groundwater. Well, we can do studies to look at how far does that decomp fluid actually go in the ground, and where are the aquifers in relationship to that, and all that kind of stuff. So I think it's you have to take their concerns seriously, but you know, uh, usually when you show them that you have thought about this and you've mitigated any risks of that, then they're usually fine with it.
There's one other question that's society based, and I know everybody in the field is going to pelt me with bricks for saying it, but I have to ask. Society loves the term body farm. We all in this field run from it like it's this diversion, this thing. But why is that? Why is that on our end? And how did that term get started and stick in
So,
society?
so the term comes from Patricia Cornwell,
Mhm.
a novel writer. That's where it comes from. And so, in that case, if you want to talk about the body farm is the University of Tennessee.
Yeah.
All of the rest of them are taphonomy facilities. Okay. As a matter of fact, we have a donor that always argues that we should be called the Body Ranch, not the Body Farm. Okay. I think it probably the reason anthropologists are so against the term, I guess, is mainly just because it's it has kind of a disrespect maybe to it a little bit, but I don't know if that's necessarily true either. But I mean, first of all, we're not farming bodies. So it's not accurate in that sense. And I think as scientists, you tend to be like, you know, you try to use accurate terminology. And so that's part of the thing too. But I think that, and I guess I probably shouldn't speak for University of Tennessee, but my understanding is that they've actually kind of gone with it now, and they're willing to say we are the body farm, and and I think in that sense it's true, um, and like I said, we never use the term ourselves, but I also realize that um, you know there is never going to be a reporter that doesn't use it. For example, even if you say to them, "We never use the body farm, and we would prefer that you don't," the first thing will be, Dr. Wescott says that they don't use the term body farm, and they prefer that we don't. But at the body farm,
I think some of that is probably, I mean, similar to like anytime I try to explain my job to anyone who doesn't know what anthropology is, I'll like explain it and they'll be like, I think I understand that. And I'll be like, you seen the show Bones? And then they're like, oh, I get it. And so it's like, even though you're like, that's not what I do, but you get kind of what's happening. And so I feel like using terms like the body farm, people are, you can be like, it's not this, it's not this, it's not this. But the second you say body farm, they're like, oh, I know what you're talking about. And then everything clicks.
exactly, yes.
Um, and we're coming up on the hour here, and I do have one last question though. We have like we said, we have a number of undergraduate students, and for those undergraduate students out there, if they are considering conducting some sort of decompositional research, what's some piece of advice that you have for them? I know, like for myself, I'd recommend reading some of that older research, trying to find out what gospel theories are a little bit on the weak side, but also make sure you have a strong stomach. What are some of the wisdom that you would give undergraduate research students when it comes to decompositional research?
So I think, one of the things is that, things have been decomposing, forever. And, but it's amazing how little we know about decomposition. And so one of the things that I always tell people is what you want to do is do research that helps you understand these processes, and then you can apply them. One of the problems that I see a lot of times is people it's like, I'm going to come up with a method for estimating the postmortem interval. Well, you don't even understand the postmortem interval yet. So start with the basics. Ask some very straightforward questions that you can get data on, sufficient enough data to actually answer, right? And then that will lead you to your next question, and then your next questions and things like that. But I think that a lot of times people try to start out with the big thing, and you're never going to get it there. I mean, that's true not only for undergraduates. I mean, I see people in the profession that do that, and they come in, they're like, we're going to do this, and I'm like, you don't even understand the basics of it. Why don't you start with, how does this even work?
Well, Dr. Wescott, with that, I want to thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's been a great pleasure. I have learned a lot.
Same. I mean, this is definitely a treat for me because I don't get to do decomp stuff very often. So
Well, thank you very much. I very much enjoyed talking to both of you, and if you're ever in the Central Texas, let me know, and can
yeah,
work
for
out
sure.
some. We'll give you a little tour or something.
I'll get the paperwork rolling to actually do the things that I want to do.
I am happy to email you the paperwork too.
Cool.
I,
I
I've
would say,
often told my family and friends, if I drop dead, just toss me in the woods and watch me rot.
no, see,
Uh,
I'm like, blow me up, catch me on fire, throw me out of a plane. I don't care. Do something cool.
Yeah.
But if along the same lines of emails though, do you care if we like along with posting of the podcast, if we like put out maybe your work email or something, so if any of our listeners have questions, they can reach out to you as well?
Sure. More than
Cool.
happy. So yeah,
Perfect.
yeah. I'm always I always try to answer everybody's emails, so I will do that. Um, sometimes I'm a little slow, and sometimes I'm really quick. But one of the things I will say to people about emails: if you email me and I don't answer you within a certain period, please email me again. And because if it gets way down on my list, then it may take me a while. But a lot of times what I may do is just say, this is the best person for you to talk to about this, but they have more expertise or something of that nature. So.
Perfect. Well, we appreciate
Great.
you being here for sure. And we thank everyone for listening. You know, every week we try to, or every week, oh no, every month we try to get more people on. And so if anyone listening has, found interest in decomp, if you want us to bring on more to talk about decomp or even more towards the taphonomy side of this type of research, or if you have other questions that you want us to try to get answered, just email us and we can try to set up some other interviews to answer those types of questions. Ashley, do you have anything you want to say?
No, Jenna's sorry she couldn't be here. She's actually doing some real adulting. She's closing on a house. So thanks for joining us this week on the Bone Club. We'll be back in a few weeks with um, Jessica Campbell on cold cases.
Cool.
So,
All right. Well, thank you again.
thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Have a nice evening.
All right. Hello, friends. We here at the Bone Club understand how difficult it is for students to break into the field of forensic anthropology. To help with that cause, we have decided to monetize in a way by setting up an account with Patreon. All proceeds will be donated to the anthropology section of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences to help alleviate the cost of attending an annual scientific conference for students. If you can, we have set up 4 membership tiers with patreon.com/theboneclub that range from $3 a month to our patrons of the bones at $15 a month. We hope some of you can join us in this worthy endeavor of breaking down the barrier of cost that keeps many students away from these important conferences. So if you can, please join us at patreon.com/theboneclub. Thank you, and may your skeletons always be complete.